we haven't done this for a while, and um, so now I don't even know what we do. What do we do when we do shit like this?
We go 3, 2, 1. Like that.
Nice. I was ready. Like it was like Jason Bourne with the clapping. It just kicked in.
To me, it was a little more like Jason aborted, but whatever.
Ooh, nice.
Is that what we're talking about today?
We're talking about movies, folks, or people, or whatever you want to be called. Tell
Oh, I
us.
thought it
Drop
was
us a line.
politics.
Um, yeah, I don't know. Oh wait, hold on a second. Because of the magic of editing, I have to find a middle name. I have to find a middle name, and I bet you have them all lined up. You
Oh my God, not
person.
even close. I forgot that was even a thing we did.
See, but yeah, so we're just gonna piecemeal this shit together. All right, I found mine. I'm ready whenever you are. Do I started? So that's unless you don't have anything.
I'm Harland, sponsored by Grant.
I'm Ryan Doug's Diggett McKenna.
Oh, that's a good one.
We're the Dawdlers.
Yeah, it's Dawdler's Philosophy Podcast. Probably short, but we'll see.
I don't know. I don't know what this will be. Long, short, medium. Okay. Okay. What are we talking about today, Ryan?
We're talking about one of our old. Oh, wait. You asked Ryan.
I know. And drop us a line, folks, if you thought that was confusing. Um, yeah, we're talking about today something that I'm kind of nostalgic for, which it kind of landed in the world's lap, or my lap in the world. And um, today's like, post-Trump election 2016 or whatever. Everything's very everything's a raw wound in the world today, and it's just the makeup of people exchanging information, ideas, and opinions, and whatever. It makes things reactionary, etc. But prior to this, if you just woke up out of a coma, that started in 2016, and you're waking up now, and you're like, what's going on? Prior to this, there used to be, you know, I don't know what to call it, like intellectualism stuff, even if it was a bunch of people wearing ass hats or whatever. Um, there was an attempt, somehow to have this like discourse, and it kind of went away immediately. Once what's his name is grabbing everybody by the pussy, and anyway. Um, so what I witnessed on social media, because like everyone else, I'm there. Um, was an exchange on Twitter between two evolutionary biologists. I guess you could say it was evolutionary biologists, even though one of them's kind of a philosopher now and whatever. The two people are David Sloan Wilson and Massimo Pigliucci. And I think that's how you say his last name. I know Harland.
Sounds good to me.
Harland, when we first ever mentioned his name, he was like Pigliucci or whatever. You have your own little history with him. But anyway, him and his ideas are shit. So how this all kind of got going was, one of the things that David Sloan Wilson, I guess you could say he's one of the main advocates or proponents for selection above, I guess you could say group selection if you want to be old and ancient about it, as opposed to like individuals being selected, individual organisms. Again, it's evolutionary biology. And he kind of pushed it forward. He had a paper in 1975 where he did some math, and he was able to show that it can work, group selection. He's just always pushed this, and it's been his big deal. So he's kind of in a way, not polar opposites from Richard Dawkins, but he's kind of on the other side, because Richard Dawkins is much more gene-centric and, reductionist and all that. And David Sloan Wilson, he's now created this or constructed this phrase called multi-level selection theory. It's not just a phrase, it's a theory. And, he touts it pretty much. That's his thing. And so he's all into trying to apply evolutionary theory to human affairs and systems created by people. And so part of that's culture, and part of that's, government, politics. It could be other kinds of institutional factor or parts of the society, like school districts and things like that. So anyway, he was putting something out there, as he always does, where he had, sent out something about this particular kind of historical research that I've mentioned before, this guy Peter Turchin. He was like, "Hey, Peter, what about the Greek civilizations? Have you studied them?" And Massimo Pigliucci was just like, "Shut the fuck up."
Oh, I didn't even know that was how it started. So he just came swooping in.
Yeah.
I saw you tweet at this other guy something, and I'm going to tell you guys to fuck off.
Stop it. Yeah. Like, what was the Bob Newhart, therapy thing with Mo Collins? Stop it.
Stop it.
So, of course, this is painting everybody unfairly, but, whatever. Get your own damn podcast. So,
Stop it.
Anyway, Massimo is skeptical of the application of natural selection to various matters of, human society. And cultural evolution, I'm not saying he's against it entirely, it doesn't seem like, but he's just like, he's all show me, that kind of thing. And that kicked off some, back and forth on Twitter between the two. And then, of course, David Sloan Wilson is one of those kind of people who's like always roping others in. And he's like, come on, he's getting other people to join in, trying to get them to join in. And Massimo, and it's like his arms are crossed and he's like, nope, that kind of thing. So they both agreed, or at least Massimo, I'm sure it was David Sloan Wilson who extended an invitation to Massimo to do this thing called Letters. It's at letters.wiki.com or something like that. And, this is a place where intellectuals who have disagreements or whatever can go back and forth with each other by having a more extended forum to, or extended place to extend their arguments even further, a forum for that. And that was in response to Massimo saying, you can't have a good argument, with somebody on Twitter. It's just not possible. And David Sloan Wilson, of course, kept like prodding him and was like, yes, let's argue anyway. And Massimo's like, no, you can't make me. And so finally, I think this is what happened. So they ended up going and writing letters back and forth. I think there's 7 or so or 8, something like that. And I read through them once or twice, but some things piqued my interest, but I just was like, hey, we did the Zizek-Peterson debate, which I've expressed to you in, one-on-one, just us, that I'm like, oh, why did we do that? Because it's just, come on. It's too easy. And so I thought this is a little bit more, I think, our speed. It's a little more obscure, and it's actually something that I personally, intellectually care about. And I don't think that's drivel. I do think that it's two people talking who have a disagreement about something, and it may not produce any real fruit or anything like that, but there's a little bit of heat, a little bit of light, and I'm just nostalgic for this at this point, because it doesn't happen.
I kind of like that point that you're reminiscing about the good old Obama days.
Yeah,
when, in general, in American society, things were a little more settled, and there were some space opened up for the nerds to get heard, instead of just rushing into their little mouse holes and worrying away at their kernels of corn that they were able to steal.
Or at least, we're under the illusion that that's something that we can do. And so then people do it, Yeah. And so that's kind of where I think this all started. I mean, my thinking was, this is kind of how I summarized the exchange between the two of them to an extent. David Sloan Wilson says something to the effect of, did you see that plane in the sky? And Massimo would be like, I definitely saw something, but I couldn't say it was a plane. What makes you think it was a plane? And Wilson would be like, it had wings, and it flew in the straight line or whatever. And Massimo would be like, lots of things can do that. You can't prove. That's kind of the back and forth as I saw it. Anyway. Something like, it's hard to fly a plane. That's his other thing with Massimo. I don't know. It's hard to identify planes in the sky. You don't understand. That's his one of his big things in this discussion. So the idea in general is that David Sloan Wilson applies this notion of multi-level selection theory to cultures and cultural evolutionary events and phenomena and stuff like that. And Massimo's saying it's not that easy. I think that's the basic crux. And David Sloan Wilson is like, au contraire, or whatever, and then back and forth. That's kind of...
Right. Okay, so Sloan Wilson is the proponent, if not the originator of MLS.
Yeah.
Right, of the multi-level selection. And then he's talking to a colleague, Turchin, who also accepts that theory and applies it in his work.
Correct.
Right? So he was like, hey, Turchin, look at it. Maybe you could do a paper about this. I got an idea. I'd like to see somebody do it, but I don't want to do it because I'm busy writing books about this view of life.
Yeah.
So, go do this work. And then Pigliucci has an alert for any time anybody talks about Greece, because he's all into that right now. And so he gets dinged, and it shows up on his thing. Did somebody talk about ancient Greece? That's my domain. And then it's like, oh my God, you're talking about applying evolutionary thinking to the Peloponnesian War?
Yeah.
No, stop it.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And then Wilson says, why not? And Pigliucci says there were two things, right? One, it's hard, and two, it's speculative, right?
Right. Yep.
And he's the type, at least, I don't know how often he is this type, but in this conversation, he was the type of guy that was saying, I think, you can correct me, give me the numbers, right? It has to be, what's the word? The philosopher's like, what's the word for this?
What?
When you can...
Measured? Or there's got to be measurements? Is that what you're trying to say?
That's not the word.
I don't fucking know. We're lost.
We got to be able to put numbers on everything.
Quantify?
Or, I don't care. Yeah, you have to quantify everything.
Yeah. Okay.
And then Sloan Wilson is like, okay, I agree with you. Quantification is nice. I would also like to be able to do that. But to criticize me for not being able to do it yet is like criticizing someone in 1880 for not being able to quantify biological evolutionary thinking. It's the Wild West still. We don't have our units and our numbers worked out. I don't know. Is that at all what part is kind of how it started in the letters?
That's kind of seems to be the natural back and forth. But David Sloan Wilson he never doesn't have his convert hat on. He's just like, convert to my way of thinking. Like he constantly, you could see he's just like, no, Massimo, like he tries all these tricks, like make Massimo feel bad about like, you were so cutting edge and what happened, like that kind of like shit. Because he mentions about how Massimo kind of put together this Altenburg 16 or whatever the fuck they called it, meeting where people would come together and say, there was this evolutionary modern synthesis that happened in the early part of the 20th century, early to mid, and we think that it needs a little bit more primping and whatever, and so came up with this idea of extended evolutionary synthesis. We've got new stuff that really wasn't addressed in the modern one, and we want to keep it, pushing things forward or whatever. And Massimo was a big part of that. And so because Massimo, in my opinion, he's compared to us, he's a total hustler, and so is Sloan Wilson. These people are like, great institution, and I'll be on the cutting edge of this, and and so David Sloan Wilson was invited to that because he's the MLS guy, and other people, other developmental stuff, epigenetics really got kind of brought up into the mainstream of discussion or whatever, for at least at the academic level. It was no longer just simply a pocket where people were kind of forgotten or whatever. So there are all these things happening. Niche construction had its moment in the sun for that too. So anyway, so he's kind of also poking at him for that and be like, you were the one who God called us together and now you're pushing us away, what happened, that kind of thing. So there's a little bit of that going on. And that's just the, that, I mean, I noticed that. So it feels like I'm talking gossip, but it was in the letters, and it was also in the, in the tweets that Sloan Wilson sent out. And my guess is that it irks the shit out of Massimo, because I'm sure he doesn't like to, feel like he's not relevant anymore or whatever. But the other thing I want to say, though, is that he wrote this thing, Twitter, I sent to you because we were kind of slowly gearing up for this. So I sent you a little tweet that he put out that I saw, and he says, my new self-description on Twitter: professor of philosophy at City College, evolutionary biologist, student of Stoicism. Somehow I've become by default a gadfly to both philosophers and scientists. And then he said, that was an end quote of the description, self-description on Twitter. And then he says, I would have never thought that when I started back in 2010, 2010, which is philosophy. I guess that's sort of maybe when I thought he got his philosophy career started well before that, but whatever that is, maybe when he started Twitter, I don't know. But it's kind of one of those things where I noticed earlier, there's this other guy who's probably our audience knows better than us, I'm guessing. He does Nigel Warburton, and he does Philosophy Bites podcast, and Massimo, I noticed one time, just because Warburton generally, like Frankish and other people on our feed, tweet relatively frequently. Usually it's just hey, I read this and this is interesting, that kind of thing. But he sent something out. Warburton said something out, and Massimo did the same thing to Warburton that he was doing to Sloan Wilson. It was just sort of like, no, it's not, no, like that kind of thing. And Warburton was like, Jesus Christ, he was coming back with responses, but at the same time, you could tell he was just sort of like, I was not expecting you to come at me with your hammer. Every scientist and philosopher is a nail mass. No, I'm sorry. That was part of the letters. I guess we can leave the
clause that stuck out to me about the Massimo's self-description there was by default. And that's what you're stressing. You're like, what do you mean by default? You're the one who's out there yelling at everyone who crosses your path, whatever.
Yeah, you get a certain, there's an odor and you don't like it, and which again, that is pretty much what Twitter is, right? But I guess, you know, he's taking aim at his own colleagues. No one gets by Massimo. Anyway, but I was like, okay, so that was one part of it that I thought was neat. Anyway, so but in general, you know, I guess some of the stuff that got me was this kind of stuff always blows up to a larger theme or whatever for me, you know, these kinds of things, because I'm always surprised that, like, even in the letters, I don't feel like they're putting themselves out there. Like, they're not really taking risks here. Like, you know, Massimo keeps saying in letter after letter, like, tell me about the Peloponnesian War, damn it. And they're like, Alcibiades, or whatever that guy's name is, like, what did he do? You know, like that kind of stuff. And so, and then, of course, Wilson always says something to the effect of, like, yeah, I know you want the details, I'm going to give them to you. And then he doesn't. You know, so it's like he just keeps doing the theory stuff. Even though Wilson could have probably given him some details, because in the book he wrote with the philosopher of biology, Elliot Sober, Unto Others, they did highlight particular, it was in the 20th century, I think it was the early 20th century, in Sudan, there were two people who fought against each other, and I think so there was the Nuer and the Dinka or something like that, and the Nuer won, and part of it, I thought that the explanation was that they were more cooperative with each other to win out over the Dinka or whatever. And I guess this is a good opportunity to kind of maybe try and flesh out some of the actual background and ideas and stuff that these guys are talking about, because we've said multi-level selection theory, but what the fuck is that, you know? Or, you know, group selection, or fucking Peloponnesian War, you know, like, I don't know what anyone would know about all these topics. We'll leave, like, the link in our description so you can go and read the shit yourself and say we got it all wrong. So I thought in some ways, you know, if you want, we can still talk about different points in the letters if you had any that stood out to you. But then I thought we can also be branching out into a little bit more larger themes, you know?
Yeah, let's do it. Get into the ideas. Screw these people.
All right, let's do it. All right, so my biggest thing when I think about, you know, it was the question that Massimo posed in one of the letters to, I suppose I should just go fucking hunt this shit down. Where he's talking to David Sloan Wilson. He basically starts grilling him about, like, what's being selected. Massimo's grilling Wilson. He's basically saying, like, who are the groups and how are they reproducing is basically his main question when it comes to, say, this particular example of the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece. Is around, you know, before 400 BC. I think it ended in 404 or something like that. Yeah, so he says,
I ask again, what counts as a group and why? Was Athens a group? Was the Peloponnesian League? Were the Spartan Helots?
You know, and then he says,
did these groups reproduce? How? What was the offspring?
You know, he starts asking all these kind of questions. And this is where I'm like, this is fine if you're playing it safe, but none of the ideas are being actually discussed, because I think these are crucial. Like, you could ask these questions about anything, especially even biological, like, what is an offspring? What is an organism? What is an individual? What's a group? What's, you know, like, all of a sudden, like, you're like, uh-oh, shit's falling apart. And these two are just, talking to each other, or at times perhaps talking past each other. And so my thinking is, and it's always been this way, and I think we've talked about this. I've got these two issues that I don't think there's an easy answer. There's no just like, oh yeah. There's like useful ways and heuristics to talk about these things, but essentially I don't think we have any of this stuff nailed down. And these two things are essentially the distinction between an individual and a group, whatever, group, collective, however you want to talk about it. And then the idea about, and we won't talk about this today, but maybe someday, like what's the difference between evolution and development? Like what do we really want to talk about when it comes to those two things? But whatever about that second one. Today, we're kind of just going to focus on the group and individual, because at times in the past, when you and I have been at a pub and drinking beers and talking to each other, I remember sometimes you've pushed back at the whole idea like species or whatever, like it's all just individuals. And I have at other times pushed back and been like, well, we could also maybe say it's all just groups, like, because things are part and they're also kind of parcel. Like it depends on what, and that's the main thing that I think, and I know you've talked a lot about this as well, which is I think it depends on boundaries and where we're going to talk about what's a boundary. And, even if you don't have a definition, what would you say are characteristics of something that you would say is a boundary? And that's something that is much deeper than just Peloponnesian War or applying some theoretical model to a certain kind of scenario or type of phenomenon or something like that, like cultural evolution or whatever. Does this all sound good to you?
Yep.
Oh, right. And then, of course, the other thing is, what's reproduction? What do people mean? And when I read books by philosophers of biology and stuff like that, it still seems quite slippery. Like, it's not like, I think you can have simple ways to just say, let's agree that it's this for right now, and then start to work from there and try and see where we get, rather than saying, no, it has to be a cuddly little creature, that popped out of this female's JJ. Anyway, so there's some room here to actually have a little bit more of a conversation, I think. I hope.
Yeah, too bad these guys didn't do it.
Jesus Christ, guys. So
I do think there was a lot more talking past than two in this.
I do too.
But those, to me, are fair questions, and I'm okay with Massimo raising them. Mm-hmm. If you want to apply evolutionary thinking to this, and then they had a little moment where Sloan Wilson was like, well, you got to define what you mean by evolution or whatever. But they succeeded at that part. They both brought up the 4-part, who was that by? The four things?
Yeah, the Tinbergen, Nico Tinbergen. But then Massimo was like, well, then for that matter, let's do Aristotle.
So they agreed about that, and then those are legitimate questions. If you're going to do an evolutionary analysis, you're going to need to tell me what the unit is and how it reproduces and blah, blah, blah. Right? In order to do our quantification.
In order to, I guess in some ways, even in order to know what you want to quantify, to know where to start, like what direction are we going to head in now that we have this framework, how are we going to capture this information that will help us understand what we think is going on? And I'm thinking, I guess I could just sort of attack these two things to the depth of which I have attacked them, which is, I don't know if it's deep or shallow or whatever. When it comes to, and I guess just for tonight, because we only give ourselves 2 hours more or less, and I think that's fine. When I think about reproduction and when I look into reproduction, I just think the safest thing to talk about is just copying, like copies, making individual entities out of, some model or whatever it is from of another kind of individual entity, and that the thing that connects them, or the thing that we are focusing on in this respect, is fidelity. And so it can be really low fidelity or it can be really high fidelity copies. And I know there's a big push to want to like corner the market in biology and talk about reproduction and replication and all that kind of stuff. But I just think that these words have way too much action in other areas. And I kind of think that the idea of copying is bigger probably than biology. Like, so it's seems to me like we can still bump it up and say maybe this is some type of process that is used in biological systems, that we could say maybe it happens in chemical systems and physical systems and things like that happen. Imprints happen and molds and casts and all that. It can happen, like we're making more, whatever. So anyway, that's the one thing. The thing, of course, that in biological systems binds these copies has a lot to do with some degree of inheritance in terms of material, as well as other kinds of information. And there's usually obviously some kind of, at the base, some type of genetic, blueprint or whatever analogy you want to use, some type of framework that's genetic that allows for this information to get passed on. But in a way, I think about genes and DNA as being some way to stabilize this process rather than simply the the end itself. It's kind of more just this is a molecular arrangement that allows for the kind of again the stabilization of this process of reproduction. And reproduction, what would be the point of that in a biological system other than living long enough to die and then that information is lost? I don't know. Maybe it's just an accident, but somehow gets bundled up and captured and stabilized and it continues on its way. So that to me, I think about when I think about copying, high fidelity. There's division, there's addition. Division could be like could be halving, but it doesn't have to be, just even proportions. You could have one thing separate into 12 or whatever. I don't know. Or one separate into 2, that kind of thing. And then you could also have, I'm thinking budding. There could be some kind of budding that occurs, and then separates in some particular way. And then, of course, there's additional copies that could be made where, you just have two things come together and they create something out of, the two. And so some inheritance occurs in that way, particularly with respect to, say, if we're going to talk about biological systems, that's like sexual reproduction, where you bring two sets of genomes, or, well, half a set each. They come together, they mix and match like a deck of cards. They, shuffle it up, create a new offspring, or a new individual or whatever, or many individuals. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry, you were going to maybe say something. You breathed. I heard the breath.
Oh, you're paying so much attention. Sounds good to me. I like it. If we use the term copying for this, the example that comes to my mind is just you've got the Xerox machine down the hall in the office building and you're making copies. And so we can talk about at least 3 different things regarding copying. There can be the process, the strategy, and the mechanism. The process is the whole deal. It's made of the human being who walks down there with their little manila folder and the paper and the machine and the act of lifting the lid and placing it in the upper right-hand corner, blah, blah, that whole thing, pushing the button, wait. That's the process. The strategy, in this case, I would describe as something like information extraction, transduction, and recreation, or something like, the machine pulls out somehow this information and it stores it inside in a different way, and then it takes its materials, the little ink or whatever, and it makes a new one.
Right.
And so the mechanism is just that machine, the Xerox machine, and the ink and it's the whole, that which makes the copy. And then in the biological thing, like you were saying, there might be different strategies. Some might just split, and some might do the whole sex thing, and those would be different types of strategies. And then DNA would be part of the mechanism aspect.
Yep. The machinery.
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
so that all works for me.
Right. And so in some machinery might, if you're talking about behavioral, and we're talking about other things like memes and just in general imitation or whatever you want to call it, emulation, that could be neurological and not necessarily be at the level of genes or something. And the mechanism could be some fucking firing going on between neurons and whatever. Mirror neurons. Sorry, I'm not a fucking neuro guy.
See, that right there is part of the argument for memes. Because it's like mirror neurons had nothing to do with what you were just saying. But that meme is in your brain, and as soon as the word meme gets activated, then the phrase mirror neurons gets activated or whatever, and you're just like, I gotta say it! And then you just fucking say it even though it doesn't belong.
Well, it's funny because I remember reading something about that, and they thought that was going to be one of the potentials, was that they were able to understand why learning happens or something. But maybe I'm totally fucked up about that. I don't know. Whatever.
That's another thing that I had picked up on. This isn't necessarily the place to bring it up, but since you used the word, how did they go through these 7 letters without using the word meme? It must be that they're consciously avoiding it because it's a bad word in their group, in their culture community, right? Like, how can they not use the word?
I think when it comes to someone like David Sloan Wilson, he, like I said, I think earlier here, he's kind of on, I wouldn't say opposite ends from Richard Dawkins, but he's definitely not in the Richard Dawkins camp. And he is, I think, a frustrated individual when it comes to gene centrism type thinking or whatever. And Massimo, I think, I have no idea whose side he's on. So it's like, why would he bother, And so that's kind of my thinking. The damn, what was he, a gadfly? So, yeah. So there you have it. They didn't mention memes, and there might be good reasons. Or whatever, reasons.
There might be, reason. Okay, so anyway, we were doing the copying thing.
I think
the thread?
I like it. So, but to me, I'm thinking one of the factors here, at least that's important within the framework part of the framework that I'm trying to set up anyway, would be fidelity. How well, reproduced or copied is what came before. And the strategy may not be to have a good copy, in like a high fidelity copy, but it's still, I think, a part of this, because I'm setting up, that's just an axis. What I'm setting up is, we've talked about this I eventually kind of went there with Try and Enjoy, that episode where I was talking about the quadrants, like if you think about a window, with the thing, like the cross between the 4 panes of glass. And then, of course, some people may be familiar with that sort of political one where there's authoritarian and libertarian, and then conservative and liberal, or left and right, or whatever. And I kind of want to set up something like that tonight, just a little, okay? So so if we're not completely finished with copying, I will, hand it back over to you. I mean, we'll be revisiting these things, of course, but I kind of want to set up the other axis. That's my next move. I don't know about.
Okay, do it.
Okay. So then the other thing is that what is being reproduced? Like, what is it what's the entity, and how do we think about it? Do we want to call it an individual, or, to what degree do we talk about this thing, whatever it is, as a single entity versus being comprised of multiple entities? And of course, the more we learn about things, unfortunately, the closer, the sooner, as soon as we learn more about it, that seems like inevitably we start to, in our reductionist ways or whatever it is, we break it down into pieces and all that kind of shit. But it's not stupid or anything like that. It makes sense. There's cells in our bodies, and as far as our understanding of evolution and the evolutionary history of bodies is that they're comprised of these little cells, and that these cells at one time, their ancestry belongs to, free living, not being all bound up in a body, and multicellular bodies and all that kind of shit, plants, fungi, and animals. And anyway, the question then to me, when we talk about, is it, do we want to talk about it as an individual, or we want to talk about something as a group? I do think it comes down to talking about boundaries, and in particular, when I think about boundaries, I think about, permeability. And I think we've had this conversation before, just one-on-one, maybe on the podcast at times, I don't know. But, you could have varying degrees of permeability with respect to the entity's level of influence, like what it will be influencing. So, the impact of a single bacterium at the base of a skyscraper, that is not, those two things are kind of separate from each other. So the bacteria is going to have influence on perhaps other bacteria, and that kind of stuff. So when we talk about the world of the bacteria, what has influence on it, I don't know, the whole thing of we would call a skyscraper has influence on a bacteria. I don't know. I think it's not as useful to think of it in that way. I think it'd be more useful to think about whatever's in your immediate environment and whatever it is that you can extract stuff from or avoid or whatever. It doesn't have to be an agency entity type thing, but it's useful to talk about it in that way. And so permeability, the boundary having some degree of permeability, allows some degree of autonomy in the thing that we're going to talk about. And a lot of this, of course, is a big open door for you to also swagger in with talking about language and whatnot, I think. But when it comes to permeability with respect to boundaries, I'm talking about, a high permeability boundary has like many degrees of freedom and it's inclusive, and then something that has low permeability in it, relative to its environmental context has few degrees of freedom and is exclusive. It's essentially, I think about it, this book I was reading by this guy, Alan D.M. Rayner, he wrote a book in 1997 called Degrees of Freedom. And it's a subtitle is Living in Dynamic Boundaries. He's a mycologist, which is a person who studies fungi. And he gives an example in this book about like just, and this is what makes me think about this, but, just a glass jar with marbles in it. And if you keep putting more marbles in it, they start to pack in, and their boundaries are interacting with each other. But depending on how you're looking at the situation, you could think of it just as one thing, but as soon as you get closer, say you're in the jar, you're like, oh, it's all these marbles in it, like you're getting all these various perspectives. But I think about like low permeability boundaries and entities, things are kind of packed in a little bit more versus something that's much looser with low permeability. And I don't know why this keeps coming to my head, but I think of like a hand of cards. It's like or a stack of boxes for the chimpanzee to climb up and grab the banana. Like the boundary or the degrees of freedom, it's sort of a tentative arrangement, and it is essentially bound by the behavior of the chimpanzee, this stack of boxes or whatever. And we call it an entity. And I guess you could say it has, a boundary if you're talking about the boxes and you're touching it or whatever, but it also has this, gravitational force, and it has to be constructed by the damn chimpanzee, and it could easily fall over and chimpanzee breaks its leg or whatever. Like it's not like, within the environmental context of like an aqueous solution with the bacteria flowing through. The bacteria seems like it might be kind of a hardy thing compared to, say, just some random ass molecules that are trying to stick together. Anyway, so that's kind of how I'm looking at permeability and boundaries and whatever we want to call a group or an individual and how we're going to look at it. And that would be like the other axis. So I don't know, say the fidelity, low to high fidelity is an x-axis, and then the y-axis in this Cartesian coordinate system would be permeability, or something like that. And in these quadrants, what would we say falls in them, as far as, when we think about what its reproductive strategies or whatever are, and whether or not we consider it a group or we consider it an individual, and how do we go about doing that, and where, so is there some place for multi-level selection theory to be applied to cultural evolution in this quadrant, or this set of 4 quadrants?
What's the X and Y again?
Damn it! God, you sleeping on the job. The X is fidelity. You can go from low, low to high would be going from, I don't know, right to left on your screen. Sorry, we're not sharing screens. Anyway. And then I have high permeability up at the top and then low permeability down at the bottom.
Okay, of what?
Oh, with respect to the boundaries of the individual / it has to do with the boundary, and it has to do with what we want to talk about regarding individuals. So how does
a boundary have a position on the x-axis? How is a boundary more or less fidelous? Or what,
no, it's not. It's not the boundary that's got fidelity. That's the reproduction axis. That's the copying axis. Have I lost you?
Yeah.
Damn it.
Because I thought the way these things worked is that you take one individual's political beliefs and then you move that person somewhere on the X and somewhere on the Y. But yours is different. One is a boundary and one is a copying process or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I don't see even how it's on.
Well, like if these are 2 variables that we find to be important, I'm saying they are because of how we talk about applying some kind of selection mechanism to something like cultural evolution, which is what their debate was, or discussion in the letters was about. And
so one of the dots might be in the, let's say it's a high fidelity, low permeability dot in that part of the quadrant. What does the dot refer to?
Well, that would be like, I guess you could say like a process like cloning or horizontal gene transfer or something like that, where, there's obviously a low permeability boundary with, relative to the environmental context, and a high fidelity, copying process. And of course, we're talking about genes. Maybe you could also put the damn Xerox machine, because compared to, me, it seems to have a pretty sturdy boundary, and it has a way to feed information in, but you just don't pass paper in through the wall of the thing. Has to go in a particular slot, just like with a bacterium. And, you don't just, and nothing just passes through whenever it wants. It has to, there's checkpoints and stuff, and there's, things have a little bit more, there's more of an effort and more autonomy and control of the entity over what goes in and out of it. So if a bacterium was answering the political questions, that's where it would land. Like, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about other things touching your insides? Bacteria would be like, I don't like it. How do you feel about when, different things? I don't like them. What if your children are different? I don't like that either.
Stop it!
They'd land in that quadrant. Your kids want to do something else for a living. No, they can't. They're going to stay in the business or whatever. Bacteria would land in that quadrant. that kind of thing, I guess.
Okay.
Does that make better sense to you, or no? Off the rails.
Well, what this is doing is reminding me of a future episode, because I don't like many of the things you said in this, but I also don't want to spend this episode arguing about it. So we should probably do like a boundary episode, because we both like that topic. So I think, and I also am losing how this is attached to Wilson and Pigliucci. So I think we should I'll try to work with it, and then you use it to help them in their dispute.
Well,
if that's what it's for.
I've already I'm pretty much trying to, that's like a zoomed out, like that's my attempt to zoom out from what it is that they're talking about.
Okay, yeah, so, a way to address your new tool, because Sloan Wilson is always talking about his toolbox. That's the person who gets the job done is the one who has a toolbox. Yeah. I've got all these things. So you want to make a tool for his toolbox, right? With this quadrant thing, with this axis.
Well, I mean, in a way, what I want to do is frame where I think this discussion is being had, and then I guess drill down from there. But I'm not sure if there's no real buy-in, then we can move on to something else.
I thought, is this what that is intended to do? This is a way, if we plot some group, is that something that might go on this, a group?
Yeah, I think
or a group evolving over time or something?
I guess. So the thing would be then what falls into these various quadrants. So something that I would say has low fidelity and low permeability would be like, sexual reproduction, that kind of thing, maybe budding. And then something that has low fidelity and high permeability would be maybe like, I don't know, a hand of cards or populations or something like that, where what we would call a boundary, it wouldn't be, maybe you're just thinking boundaries have to be physical or something, and that's where you don't like the idea of boundary in the way that I'm putting it, in terms of just an entity has some type of, thing that kind of keeps it an entity. And so a hand of cards, the things that keep it an entity would be, like you were saying, what, process, strategy, and mechanism. Process for, making new hands of cards would be the shuffling of the deck and all that kind of stuff. And then the strategy is to give everybody as, a fair chance when you, play the game to start out. Sometimes you have a good hand, sometimes you don't. So there's as unbiased a situation as possible. And then the mechanism is, the doling out of the cards in a particular way, and then to a certain point you stop, and then people look at the hand of cards that they have, which has been given to them relatively at random, and so that hand, however, depending on the game, you can take out a card and put a different one in or whatever. The permeability of what we're going to say is a hand of cards is really high, and the cards can be doing lots of things within the context of the game. They could be sitting in a throwaway pile, or they could be sitting in a pile that's yet to be pulled from, or whatever, or they could be sitting in your hand, or they could be sitting in someone else's hand, or whatever. And so the degrees of freedom can be, they could have many degrees of freedom comparatively to something like a bacteria or whatever, which is likely going to try and control and maintain its, what comes in and out and how it interacts with the world. And even though these things are very different from one another, when it comes to just like making copies and things having some kind of, entityhood or whatever, I was thinking, well, the one thing that to me seems to be at the core or whatever, or a centralized type of feature would be something like a boundary. And, to kind of talk briefly about this Rayner guy, they're dynamic boundaries. They're not static. They don't, whatever. So I'm not quite sure. Since you've pumped the brakes but still said future episode. I'm not sure where to go because now, there's a problem.
Oh, but that was the point of saying that, is to say, let's push through the problem. I'm not going to attempt to problematize it today. I just wanted you, I'm not trying to critique it. I'm trying to understand it and apply it to these two dudes. So I'm saying just keep going wherever you were going. I don't want to derail it.
So, okay. So then the last little quadrant there that I was thinking, something that's high permeability and, high fidelity with respect to, copying and boundaries and all that shit would be like, I don't know if I'm putting question marks here. I've got it written down in question marks, like songs or, and of course that being like memes, or I don't know what would fall into that last quadrant. But I'm thinking that when it comes to culture and whatnot, that these areas might be more on the, cultural evolution might, if there are boundaries at all, they might be quite permeable, meaning like even when we create state boundaries, they're not really boundaries. You know what I mean? You're not like having to climb a mountain always. Sometimes we use rivers and things like that as a way to kind of mark the difference between two places. But for the most part, when you're looking at the earth, you're not, from space or whatever, you're not seeing actual boundaries of states and things like that. You're just seeing whatever the physical landforms are and the connection between, or the contact between land and water and all that stuff. And so cultural features that would evolve to me seem to have, some may have a, high, fidelity of their copying, and some may have low fidelity of the copying, but I kind of think they all have some degree of high permeability with respect to how they change, and so that's kind of what I was thinking, just as a sort of overarching thing. So when Massimo Pigliucci says, what are the groups and who's responding? What's the offspring? It's kind of like, well, if you're looking for something that's high fidelity, low permeability, you're probably not going to find it in this Peloponnesian War. But if you're looking for something that's much more permeable and, whatever degree of fidelity, then you might be able to find it more in these anthropogenic systems.
And that's why this would be part of an extension of the synthesis. Wilson is saying, why can't we apply evolutionary reasoning to high permeability, low fidelity copying? And Pigliucci is saying, is being the conservative here and saying, I don't want to, well, let's not be so quick to start talking evolution down in this quadrant.
Right.
I don't know. It's going to be really hard to do. It's going to be really speculative. You're going to do a bunch of just so stories to make things fit. And
right.
I don't think we're ready to muck around in the lower left quadrant or whatever that one is.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of my thinking, was like, just zoomed out, it seems like, well, what are we talking about? And could this be a source of talking past each other? I don't know, because, these are the kind of things that one might want to do if they're going to get on the same page or whatever. And, yeah. So, but there's a little more to it, with respect to, and I'll let you, if you have anything you want to talk about, but there's a little more to it that I will expound upon, I guess, over time here.
Yeah, all I have is a snide comment to be like, yeah, hey, audience, you followed so far? You ready for more?
Yeah, that's what we
do.
That's what we do. So this philosopher of biology, Samir Akasha, wrote a book, I think it's 2006, Evolution and the Levels of Selection. And I know the two, Massimo and Wilson, in their letters back and forth to each other, I know the literature and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know where this book in particular falls in 2019, because 2006 was, over a fucking decade ago. So, but to me, it's still great. And I don't know how much further along things have gotten. It sounds to me like haven't gotten very far, because number one, when I read the book by Samiro Kasha, this shit goes all the way back to Darwin, and it doesn't seem like we're, and probably before, but it doesn't seem like we're that much further along based on this back and forth between these two. Still keep mentioning Darwin. I feel like we're going to get past it when we stop mentioning him. But anyway, he talks about there's kind of two types of multi-level selection. And this is also another thing that I think where kind of we start talking about what's, how do we want to talk about boundaries and whatnot. And so he calls them MLS1 and MLS2. So essentially the idea with multi-level selection 1 is that you can have multiple groups that form, but that the idea is that the group that's successful, that is selected, if you will, it's selected, but the individual entities reproduce. So they are successful at reproducing, but the group itself does not reproduce a new entity. So it's just, gets better in that group. So you could think of one group versus, group A versus group B. And group A over time has a certain number of, individuals. It has a certain amount of population growth, let's just say. And it's, I don't know, fucking a third more or whatever over time unit T1. And then over that same time unit, group B has an increase in like twice as many individuals. And so that's multi-level selection 1, where one group just does better within itself, and as it continues along, it's just whatever it has, it's more cooperative or whatever it is that's going on in that group. Those traits are being passed on. There's more success with those individuals because of the traits they've inherited, and they're creating more individuals. And in group A, they're just not. They're not able to get off their knees as well or whatever. And so that's multi-level selection 1. And that's pretty much what, in the beginning at least, David Sloan Wilson was talking about. Multi-level selection 2 is the idea of something like species selection, where one species against another species has a particular trait at a certain level. So it could be one species has a greater geographic range than another. And maybe they do compete for stuff. The one that has a greater geographic range, due to, say, length bias sampling, it's going to have a greater chance that if anything breaks off from it and becomes a new species or whatever, new lineage, that it will then produce more lineages of, itself. Now, what the level of fidelity of those copies are is probably pretty low, but you're looking at, speciation or whatever as being another kind of form of copying and offspring, that kind of thing. So that's multi-level selection 2. So there's 2 different ways in which they think about this. And so I have, I guess, a bit of an analogy, and we're going to talk about penguins. More speculation, Massimo. Okay. MLS1 produces more individuals. MLS2 produces more collectives. So imagine penguins in Antarctica, they're freezing their little nubby tails off. And one strategy that some have is to huddle together. And, they over time have this thing where they huddle, and, it just happens to be that those who, maybe it's a dynamic that occurs naturally without anyone putting any effort in or whatever, but those in the middle slowly move towards the margin of this huddle, and those at the margin are slowly moving in towards the middle. And so they circulate and whatnot, and everybody gets a chance to be really hot and also be kind of pretty cold at the edge or whatever. But that idea that they maintain their temperature, their internal temperature, they don't freeze to death, they huddle together and all that kind of stuff. And then there's those penguins that are like, fuck that shit, I'm all about me. And they go out and they're like, huddle this, bitches. And the difference between the huddlers and the non-huddlers is that in this sense, in the multi-level selection 1 sense, the huddlers are going to end up just surviving the hard times a little bit more than those that don't, who are just going to, during the hard times, might just be wandering around the fucking Antarctic ice sheet and just dying and freezing to death, and some fucking explorer finds them later. And then the ones that huddle are going to tend to pass on their babies. But, it's not always super cold. They don't always have to huddle. So just whatever it is, they pass on that. Maybe there's some genetic complement as well. Maybe there's some kind of behavioral thing that the imitators have. Maybe it's genes for imitation. I don't fucking know. So that kind of thing creates more huddlers. And the huddlers then tend to just grow in number. There's more huddlers. An MLS2 would be, you got these huddlers, let's just say, and now you're at that level where it's just like the non-huddlers don't even matter. So you have huddlers, but they're reproducing, and say it's colder than usual for a longer, and so they huddle for longer. Maybe they huddle for so goddamn long that they reproduce babies that, it's a hard thing. You've got this big old mass of huddlers. It's getting really hot on the inside. It's getting harder to move back and forth. Things are kind of hard. Overheating is a problem. Getting trampled is a problem. So then, maybe by accident, maybe whatever it is, the thing divides, right? Or it branches off. Something breaks off, and you got a smaller group of huddlers now, or groups of huddlers. And so then that idea would be a offspring, a reproductive event of, one big old huddle that then produces something else. Whether that was totally necessary, I don't know, but it was something I thought of, and I was like, I'm mentioning it. So, yeah, so that's kind of the main kind of thing that I wanted to, in addition, mention. So then when Massimo's like, what are the groups? Who's reproducing? How? In this case, I kind of think that when it comes to the Peloponnesian War, that it would be more of a MLS1 type case where you're just producing more huddlers, but you don't have to break into multiple huddles or whatever. So when it comes to something like, the background that I understand from this, and I am not a Greek scholar, and yes, I went to Wikipedia, but hey, I'm quoting not quoting, but I wanted to quote Samir Okasha. The book's in my hand. So the idea, as I understand, is Athens was a bigwig, the Athenian, league or whatever the group was called, and success breeds, bitter enemies or whatever, and the Peloponnesian League, I think, and they were the Spartans. I don't know, there was a problem, right? As there always is, and there are like multiple phases of these wars or whatever. But in general, one of the things that the Spartans were able to do was get others on their side. And I think at least by the final phase, they had Persia, this Persian empire. I don't remember what they were called, but they joined with the what am I trying to say? The Spartans. And they were able to, because they had higher cooperation, whatever it was that was going on with them, they were able to overwhelm the Athenian group and, win the war. But of course, instead of, whatever it was about Sparta, they were able to, at least within, their general surroundings, this is all, essentially, fighting happening around the Aegean Sea on both sides, east and west, in that basin. But they, for whatever reason, they decided, let's not have democracy, let's be tyrants or whatever. And, that didn't last very long. And so then there was a reactionary backlash to that, reactionary backlash to the Athenians initially. And, it didn't last very long, this tyrant state or whatever. And then democracy returned. And so they were able to be beaten back. And I think about like, okay, well, so during the war, there's lots of cooperation. Persians, there's others perhaps with the Spartans. And then during the tyrannic aftermath, Persians got nothing. And all of a sudden there was this low cooperation. And those who were also able to cooperate better, which were the Athenian and other people who were like, damn it, let's get this back or whatever, then they overwhelmed the Spartans. And so as these back and forths are occurring, whatever it is that's culturally relevant to the dominant group will be spread by whatever's, the dictates of the group are going to be. So if it's tyranny and, horribleness, then that'll get spread around, and probably people will whatever those quote unquote memes are will get passed on. And then if it's, cooperation and democracy, whatever those memes are, will get spread throughout. And so that's I think it's more of an MLS1 where you just create more individuals. And in particular, this is an individual meme or whatever. There.
What? That was the end?
The end of everything. Well, that was just the idea that I was thinking, okay, well, if we're going to talk about Peloponnesian War, I don't even know what quadrant it would fall in, but it definitely would be, I think, more on the high permeability side and within this MLS1 component that this guy Samir Akash talks about, which is where you're just producing more individuals rather than collectives or whatever.
Too bad you weren't writing letters to Massimo. It feels to me like most of what you have been engaging in with your projects tonight is sort of attempting to get started at doing what Wilson wants, right? You haven't got to precise quantification yet, but it sounds like you're trying to show Massimo, well, there are some tools that we could put in the kit and at least talk about it and look about it in these ways. And there could be benefits derived from these evolutionary style considerations.
Yeah, I mean, I would say certainly that's that's kind of the upwelling. Whether or not I actually want to do it is like another thing. But definitely, I think when I
just tweet at Peter Turchin and tell him to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Follow this thread. It's 20,000 tweets long. Yeah. And so, yeah, that was mainly what I wanted to, address when it came to the idea of, what I thought they were talking about in as good or bad a way as possible. But it's something, not nothing.
Yeah, man, it's not nothing. You're putting ideas out there.
Yep.
I don't know what I'm going to say about them. I don't think I'm going to say anything. I think I'm just going to be like, yeah, there you go. That's Ryan's thing.
There it is.
And then some other night we'll argue about what permeability means and what a boundary is.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
One thing, before we... I don't know if you're totally done or not, but one thing I wanted to say, totally separate.
Okay.
Do you want to talk more about this or no?
What? Do something separate. That's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay. I had a bell go off in my head because I've got an alarm system set up for these things. And when I got to this sentence, I thought, the whole thing now makes sense, and this entire epistolary exchange is irrelevant to me now. But Massimo let slip this. Okay, so he was quoting Peter Turchin, because they were both kind of talking about him as a ancillary member of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so Turchin wrote,
Human societies or their decision-making institutions may anticipate the eventual results of group selection in many contexts and get there first. Such anticipative selection, when it works, will yield the most rapid rate of social change.
So that's the sort of thing that MLS people say that Massimo doesn't like. And he says back to that,
Well, he may call this anticipative selection, but I call it conscious volitional decision-making.
and that's like I just went, ding, I get it now. This guy has an idol, a dogma here, and he thinks that Sloan Wilson and his crew might encroach on his free will. And that's where the whole thing comes from. Maybe I'm just reading too much into it because I'm obsessed with that kind of... I don't like it when people do that. But that really just set it off, that Pigliucci is just like, wait a minute. I really like my conscious volitional decision-making, and you guys are telling me I might not do it. And that's why he got his backup. I don't know if you even noticed.
No, that's a... now you need to go tweet that. Yeah, no, for sure. I think we all read things that, differently or whatever. But yeah, so something that is, this is what he finished it off with saying, is something that is nowhere in your math,
Yeah. We can, italics, think about stuff before acting on it. So he's emphatic and certain about that he is a conscious agent who thinks about stuff. And he's like, if I'm just merely a dot on Ryan's graph that has some degree of permeability and fidelity and stuff just happens and my boundary gets crossed and I make copies of stuff. No!
Stop it!
I don't have room in there to be a conscious thinking thing. So he just reacts against it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not against that interpretation. I'm sure he is. He'd be like, you don't get me or anything. Yeah. You want to end on that?
I don't know. That's just one thing that I picked up on and had marked to mention.
Yeah. That's like down. Oh boy, that was almost at the end.
Yep.
Criminy. Well, do you have anything else that you, or was that pretty much it? And you were like, I'm done with this.
That's it. I'm done.
Okay. All right. Well,